In this lesson, we'll introduce some of the current thinking on the puzzle of how brains produce conscious experiences. And we'll look at three general areas that bear on this question. Sleep, of course we lose consciousness during sleep. General anesthetics, so the drugs produce a loss of consciousness, and brain damage can produce a loss of consciousness. So first to introduce, then, here's our familiar brain. We have the box representing those frontal circuits involved in working memory. Let's say we've just seen the word tree pop up on a computer screen, right? So visual cortex has analyzed that visual stimulation, and it has been fed up into the working memory system. So we've got loops of activity, and I'm conscious of seeing the word tree. Of course, the contents of my working memory system can also then activate other areas of the brain, right? So if I see the word tree, I can activate autobiographical memories involving trees, or imagine what it feels like to climb the tree. Of course, I can say the word tree to myself. I can access the meaning, etc., right? So the word tree not only can directly activate some of these things, but once it gets into working memory, then the working memory system becomes a platform to activate other areas in the brain to access more information about the current stimulus. Now, the reason we introduce this here is because there is a close overlap between the contents of working memory and the contents of consciousness itself. In other words, what I'm conscious of, the word tree, is precisely the content of my working memory. And we've also learned that attention systems in the brain influence what it is that enters working memory, and so arises to a level of conscious experience. So there's going to be significant overlap between this idea of a working memory system and consciousness. So with that said, let's examine those three areas of research and see if we can come to some better understanding of how brains are producing conscious experiences. As for the sleep research, you'll recall that we compared the EEG recordings during the waking stages and compared them with the sleep stage, and the EEG pattern is very different. So during the waking stage, we have low amplitude, high frequency signals, and we said that was thought to reflect complex sort of neural communication, both local communication and long distance communication between different regions of the brain. And so when you have those scalp electrodes positioned all over the cortex, what you end up recording is this signal here, characteristic of being awake and conscious of yourself and your environment. So the cortex is busy processing what it is that your senses are presenting, as well as you can have internally generated thoughts and feelings and memories as well. But the idea is that the EEG signal is reflecting very complex patterns of conversations between neurons locally and over long distances. And this brain here just, again, gives a kind of representational view of that. We've got brain cells, the little hatch mark here would be action potentials, and there's a loop of activity here, and there's some complicated processing going on down here. And so you get widespread cortical communication during the waking stage. And this kind of cortical communication is associated with being awake and conscious. In fact, we might say, okay, so here's the visual cortex doing some kind of processing, maybe something we're seeing, and here's a loop of activity, perhaps some visual content is entering our working memory system, etc. Now, when we go to sleep, recall the EEG pattern changes significantly. So during the slow wave sleep, right, we get the high amplitude, low frequency signals, and so sleep is associated with a loss of consciousness. And the suggestion here was that brainstem systems are synchronizing populations of cortical cells so that they are firing, sort of local populations are firing together, and then just a moment later, all those same cells remain quiet. And then at the next moment in time, they fire again, high bursts of action potentials, and then they're quiet for the next moment. And that's happening all over the cortex with local populations of cells. Now, what that means, though, is that if this population of cells was communicating, sending action potentials over to a distant location, that a response from these cells may not occur because by the time these signals arrive, these cells may be in the valley stage. They may be inhibited, so to speak, so they cannot normally respond to the incoming signals. And so the brainstem systems are imposing a kind of order on the cortex in such a way that it prevents normal neural communication. You'll recall during conscious waking states, there is a lot of conversation. There is talking and then a response, right? Talking and a response. And that's metaphorical speak for action potentials sent to the target cell. Target cell responds with action potentials to the original cell. Well, during sleep, that kind of neural communication is interrupted by this brainstem-produced synchronization happening up in the cortex. So the first glimpse here as to the nature of consciousness involves this idea that consciousness requires cortical communication, both locally and over longer distances. And anything that's going to interfere with that normal type of sort of neural conversation is associated with a loss of consciousness. So if brain cortical synchronization produces loss of consciousness, then desynchronization is associated with consciousness. So our first pass at how do brains produce consciousness, you have to have a lot of sort of complicated cortical communication going on in real time for the brain to produce a conscious state. And here's another diagram indicating another way in which cortical communication can be interrupted, in this case with drugs. So we've seen how during sleep, the slow wave sleep, the brainstem can impose synchronization, right? The low frequency, high amplitude signals. So too, general anesthetic drugs can do the same thing. So the drug-induced state is one where there's a prolonged, as long as there's enough drug in the system, there's a prolonged period of cortical synchronization, kind of like during sleep, the slow wave sleep. So drugs like propofol, for example, will set up these low frequency waves in the cortex. And again, the idea is that's going to interfere with neural communication. When this population of cells is sending action potentials, by the time they reach this population of cells here, they may be unable to respond because the drug has set up a wave such that these cells are now being inhibited precisely the time they would normally respond to the incoming signals. So you get no response on the return pathway. And in this case, it's the drug that's interfering with normal neural communication. Again, that's associated with a loss of consciousness. So here we see data set number 2. Sleep is associated with a loss of consciousness. And what is the mechanism? A synchronization of the cortical cells. So the brainstem is preventing normal communication, and here anesthetic drugs can do the same thing. Now, anesthesia is not sleep, and so researchers are quick to say drug-induced brain patterns of activity are significantly different in lots of ways. For example, during sleep, if you were to injure the patient or like perform an amputation, they would wake up, right? But during drug-induced cortical slow waves, the patient does not respond. Of course, this is useful for surgery. And the idea here is that drug-induced cortical activity is more like a reversible coma, not like sleep. But what's common is this synchronization pattern, that you get these low amplitude waves all over the cortex that interfere with the communication between neurons at different locations. Now, the research using anesthetic drugs here is interesting because normally when people go in for surgery and they get a general anesthetic, the surgeon might administer the drug at doses that will produce unconsciousness. And just after administration, they might have the patient count backwards. right, from 100, let's say. And the patient will start at 100, 99, 98, 97, and at some point, right, they start to lose count. And that's interesting, right? Their working memory system's being interfered with. They can't remember what number they just said. And then soon after that, the brain, as measured by EEG recordings, the brain switches into this mode where the cortex now shows these low frequency, high amplitude waves, kind of like the slow wave sleep pattern. And it's at this stage, then, it's a rapid loss of consciousness. And as long as the drug is maintained at that level in the blood, you can maintain this kind of cortical pattern, this synchronization of the cortex. But again, the drug-induced state is not officially a sleep state, right? Because during this drug-induced state, you can do all kinds of things to the subject, so they don't feel any pain when you perform surgery, for example. Whereas if they were merely asleep, they would wake up during an amputation. And before we take a look at the brain damage data, one last consideration of the REM sleep. There is a sort of a reemergence of a kind of conscious experience during dream sleep, right? And so the idea here is, notice it from an EEG point of view, the REM EEG is similar to a waking state. So you no longer get those low frequency, high amplitude kind of synchronized patterns of neural activity. Here now you get sort of more of that desynchronized pattern, and that's being generated by a different set of brainstem signals that are sort of randomly activating the cortex. But the cortical cells are allowed to communicate, and this again is correlated with a production of an experience, a dream experience, which shares some aspects with waking experiences. So again, when the cortex is allowed to sort of talk in normal ways, when cells can communicate with each other locally and over long distances, we get an EEG pattern that's like REM or like waking. But when the cortex is either caused by drugs to enter into that synchronized pattern, low frequency waves, or slow wave sleep, low frequency waves, we get a loss of consciousness. So it suggests that cortical desynchronization is required for consciousness, and synchronized cortical activity is causing a loss of consciousness. Finally, if we take a look at what parts of the brain, when damaged, are associated with loss of consciousness, we'll see that the data fits what we've been discussing in the realm of sleep and anesthesia. Namely, if you have widespread cortical damage, precisely those areas that are normally in the communication, in the conscious, healthy, waking state, if you have widespread cortical damage due to brain injury, lack of oxygen, or whatever, you can have loss of consciousness. Likewise, the thalamus is damaged, you'll get loss of consciousness. Now, why is that? Remember, the thalamus is sort of that relay station, and it's more than that, but it's the kind of hub, the sensory hub that is sending information up to the cortex for further processing, right? So the retina sends action potentials to thalamus cells sends them to occipital cortex for vision. And your touch receptors on your skin, again, send signals up to the thalamus cells up to the cortex for processing. In your ears, you have auditory signals sent to the thalamus up to the temporal cortex for auditory processing. Damage to the thalamus can produce unconsciousness. You're depriving the cortex of inputs, right? But so too can cortical damage itself. But again, it fits with this picture that you have to have widespread and complex cortical communication for conscious states to be produced. Three things that we have seen now can interfere with that. Sleep sets up slow wave synchronization in the cortex, preventing communication. Anesthetics set up slow wave synchronization in the cortex, interfering with communication. And of course, brain damage can interfere with communication.